Thanks for tuning in to the Justin Henry Show. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, drop a like, join in on the conversation, and follow on all social media platforms. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Justin Henry Show. You're chilling with your boy Justin Henry, and I have a very special guest. You see down here at our names, right? There's a little MD there. I don't have one of those, but my man Jesse Morse does. Welcome to Fantasy Doctor himself, Dr. Jesse Morse, to talk injuries in fantasy football with us. Jesse, my man, how you doing, dog?
I'm doing great. I'm ramping up for another exciting season, and we're ready. More data, more analytics, and just have fun with it.
Yes, sir. You know, I'm actually not a big data guy, just to be real with you, but the injury side of it, I've always really followed that, right? That's always been something I've thought of. If a player's coming off injury, there's a big component to how I adjust my fantasy rankings, right? I'm not the type of player that plays scared. Like Christian McCaffrey, he's been injured all these years. Sometimes I just go for the talent, but then I also understand risk with injury. For you, Jesse, talk to me, man. How did you, get involved in that? Is that something that you saw and you're like, you know what? This fantasy space needs somebody like me?
Yeah, so back in 2016, 17, something like that, I just blended my passion of fantasy football and my knowledge of sports and medicine. I was just about to start my sports medicine fellowship, and I was like, I just want to explain these injuries simpler than a lot of people do now. And I was like, we rely on these beat reporters to expect them to know hey, what a grade 2 is and what that means and when they're going to come back and how good they're going to be. But these guys don't know any of that. I mean, they're just, rephrasing something they read or something they heard. They've got a lot better over the past several years. So, maybe it sounds really good now, but back then I was like, there was no correlation. It didn't make any sense. So I was like, I can translate this. Well, we're not perfect. We probably only know about 30 to 40% of all the injuries and all the information that they tell us, but we can really explain to a pretty good degree how a person is going to do, and make you a better player, a better, whatever you're doing.
No, that's awesome, man. And being able to attack both sides of that too, because it's not just fantasy, it also is betting too, right? When you're starting to look at these guys and you have to be able to analyze your futures, right? Those player props, we're all looking at season-long player props right now. And it's a player like a Javonte Williams or somebody, a Breece Hall coming off of injury, that affects their ramp-up time. And if they're available, but then B, their ramp-up time post-injury also affects a lot of the way that we view players.
Oh, yeah. 100%.
Would you say this, when you're evaluating talent, right? When you're evaluating talent coming into the draft, is injury something that should be a big focal point of what we look at, or should it be something that we take in at a lesser scale in account with their talent as well? If you get what I'm saying?
Yeah. So one of my opinions is that the greatest predictor of future injury is past injury. And a lot of these guys are athletic. They're all athletic freaks in some capacity.
Yeah.
But most of them are 18, 19, 20, 21 by the time they come out. And they're used to being the best player. They heal like crazy. Unless they have a bad injury, most of the time they just brush it off and they just play. But then you have your more significant injuries. Think of Kincaid with his injury. Think of Musgrave with his injury coming out. Think of Debo with all his crazy hamstrings when he was coming out. Go figure. And stuff like that. So if you don't know the injury history, you can be naive. I mean, you could watch Nick Chubb in college, and he was a freak in college, and he had one of the nastiest knee injuries you will ever see. If you have a stomach, then pull up the video. I'm still not sure how he didn't tear his ACL, but you'll be like, he's probably not going to have a good career because of that. But go figure. I mean, he's been ridiculous. He will eventually slow down because of that knee injury, but he got lucky. And then you look at a guy like Todd Gurley. He had a ridiculous start to his career, but unfortunately, when he tore his ACL when he was at Georgia, he had reportedly a significant meniscal injury. The meniscus is the cushion, the shocks for your knee. And instead of repairing it, which is what they did for Kyler this past year, they removed it. And unfortunately, with the amount of volume that he was running, that knee developed so much arthritis so quickly, there was nothing they can do by, he was what, 25, 26? And at that point, he was no longer effective, and he's already out of the league. And he was, he's still only, I think, 27 or something, So
Yeah.
it's relative. It's not a perfect science. We have a guy like Kelsey, who was not really a super high prospect. In his rookie season, he had one of the worst knee injuries you can have back in 2013 or 14, one of the two. And he hasn't missed a game due to injury since. Like, what?
Yeah.
So like some things make sense and some things just, he's just a freak, and everything's lined up perfectly. So it's kind of fascinating.
When you say freak, like I always go back. I think the most probably classic case of like somebody being a freak is probably Adrian Peterson, right? Coming off the ACL and then doing what he did the next year. And I always try to think of like, man, these guys are not just people. They're like genetic freaks, like you already talked about, at their age especially. And it's like, it's tough to predict because we look at these guys as warriors on the field. I look at a guy like Saquon Barkley, and after he came back from his ACL, I was like, I don't care. I'm still drafting him. But there is some limitation. There is history of re-injury or injuring something else, trying to overcompensate. And I think for fantasy players out there, it's tough to always admit that. Or it's tough to know how much to downgrade somebody if they're coming off an ACL. Because we see a guy like J.K. Dobbins last year was not himself at all. And now we're looking at two guys, Breece Hall, Javonte Williams, and we're like, are they going to break the mold? Are they the next Saquon or AP? And it's tough.
Yeah. So, and it's a good question. I'll answer it indirectly. So I used to be really aggressive, be like fade everyone coming off of ACL. And then for the most part, it was a good solution. If you look at the ACL data from running backs since 2011, there have been 29 running backs, 30 instances. Jamal tore his twice, Jamal Charles. There have only been 2 running backs in the first year that have exceeded their pre-injury points per game. 2. They both happened in 2011. Adrian Peterson, like you just mentioned, and Jamal Charles. There's been a couple guys that were like 5.5 before and 6.5 after, but they, nothing crazy. Those 2 are the only exceptions to the rule. Adrian Peterson is a freak. Jamal Charles is similar, not quite as freakish, but he was still really good. But it just shows you how difficult it is. You have guys like Saquon. You have guys like Dalvin. You have Reggie Bush, although he was older. You have many other athletic freaks that won Heisman's and that were ridiculous, but still couldn't beat that odd. You saw JK. This year we're going to see Breece and Javonte. It's a little bit more detailed than it used to be. And we're learning more and more, but teams are getting smarter. They're not giving them the same volume they used to expect out of them because they know that these guys can't handle that. And the first year out of an ACL is a mental game. They don't trust that knee. After the first year, most guys are like, all right, I'm good. And now they don't think about it anymore. That's why their second year, they do a lot better. And the knee has less wiggle or give. They just don't really appreciate it anymore. So it's a mental game just as much as it is a physical game. But if you look at, like, if you go back a couple years ago and you look at year 1 from Saquon coming back from ACL, and you took a picture of his legs, his ACL repaired knee, the quad was smaller than his non-ACL knee. And that's classically a mechanism because when the knee is unstable, the quad doesn't want to grow. It stabilizes. When the year after, you couldn't tell which knee was repaired because they were equal. The quads were equal, and they were both huge. That's how it takes a while for that muscle to finally start being like, oh, the knee's good. I can start growing again.
Yeah, well, it's weird because you think, all that goes into just the injury side of it. And then you mentioned, like you talked about the confidence side. Like, I think maybe that could be a good separator too, because we talk about the APs or the Jamal Charles. They may have just had confidence on their side that they could go out there and execute. And, I start to think about positional too, because you talked about running backs. When it comes to injury, is there, like, when we're drafting, should we be worried about all positions? Is there a position that we should focus on more when it comes to running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks? Because obviously, like, Kyler Murray's coming off an ACL. We've seen Joe
Yep.
Burrow come off an ACL. They're in the pocket, right? Whether it's a mobile quarterback or not, they can relax in the pocket. Receivers, they could be straight line, they could be route runners. Is there a positional thing where you're like, you know what, at this position, I'm way concerned. At this position, I'm not concerned.
It's a great question. So it's actually, it gets really specific. So running backs, in my opinion, they're getting more beat up because of the amount of cutting that they're doing. We can use the ACL like we just did, or you can use the Achilles. Now, we have yet to see a running back that fully puts it all together, like really puts it together after tearing his Achilles. You had Mikel LeSure way back when, but he only had one season and then he was out of the NFL. That was it.
That's a throwback.
And most of the guys were out of the NFL or just never really did anything. The only one that is semi-relevant is Donta Foreman, but he took 4 years to come back. He's in the same draft class as Dalvin and CMC, and like, which is crazy. But he only came back when Henry was Henry's backup. So it wasn't like, and even then he's putting up like 8. Then look at the quarterbacks, and you're like, well, Joe Burrow had a pretty bad one, and he looked pretty good. I mean, he's not a mobile guy, but he's semi-mobile. Brady had one in 2008. That was the last time he missed a game from injury, and he didn't even miss a beat. He's also not a mobile guy. But someone like Kyler, he's a mobile guy. I think I calculated his points. I don't remember exactly what the percentage was, but between 25 and 30% of his fantasy points are secondary to rushing. I expect that to dip. He's not going to have the same confidence in that knee that he would last year or 2 years ago. So he's not going to be like, oh, I'm just going to break away. He might just throw it away, So, or he might get shook. He hears those footsteps. I'm not ready yet.
For a guy like Kyler, that's huge.
Yeah. So that's why. And there's rumblings he might be ready in week 1. And if you know anything about Kyler, he's a freak. I mean, he's a genetic freak. I mean, he was drafted, I think, 8th or 9th by the Oakland A's. He gave his money back. He then went to freaking Oklahoma, won the Heisman, and then was drafted 1-1. Like, that doesn't happen. So, like, he's a freak. We know that. But even then, I'm like, their all offensive line is hot garbage. Like, I don't know who he's thrown to besides, Hollywood. And even then, like, how much is he going to run? So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. And then when you look at the data for wide receivers, they do really well. Remember Cooper Kupp? It looked like nothing even happened. But then you look at a guy like Gallup. He looked bad. Like, he looked real bad. The only one who did decent last year, Godwin. Godwin started slow. I think he had a hammy, if I remember correctly. And then he finished as the wide receiver 19 in PPR. So, okay, I'll take that. He should be much better this year. I know Baker, but whatever. We've seen the data breaks it down pretty cool. The receivers that run wide, that start wide, not the slot guys, they do better. They're less risky. I'll say that. Less risky. I mean, they all can get injured, but less risky.
Strictly because they're cutting, right?
Yeah, I just think, and they're playing, they have less hitting because they're not across the center, and they're running a lot more kind of straight routes as opposed to the kind of crazy stop and goes or across the middle or behind the quarterback and everything.
Oh, dang. So it's crazy to think about that because you start to kind of think about positionals and you always just assume that running back is like the worst and then at receiver, they can bounce back. But you start to break it down at a higher level like that, like outside, inside receivers versus the way that they have to cut, they go straight line. It's crazy how that really does have an impact, and we talked about mindset, but one of the things I'm really curious about, is there an injury like during the season as well, right? Like you talked about the mental battle a year later, but is there an injury that happens during the season and you're like, ooh, that's the injury I don't want to have happen because it's going to linger? or it's going to be a problem all throughout the year, right? Like we know the high ankle sprain, we know hamstrings, we know a lot of the consistent injuries that happen that players try to play through. Is there one that would happen in like week one? You're just like, oh shit, I got to trade this guy.
You just said it, high ankle.
The dreaded high ankle for a reason, right?
So why I happen to have my ankle model right here. So what is a high ankle and why is it such a bad injury? This is pretty much only a football injury. This does not happen in regular life unless it's something freak. And this does not happen in pretty much any other sport. This is a very specific NFL or football injury. Basically, it usually happens when the foot is down and someone pushes on the top of the foot. These two bones have a big ligament that runs up here, and they separate, and it tears. There's a thick ligament that runs across here that usually tears or partially tears. The problem with it is this is a rotational injury. So whenever you're trying to put weight and rotate, you can't do it. It's very painful. Even a grade 1, the lowest grade, you have trouble putting your foot down. It hurts to put your foot down. Now, I'm not talking about running. I'm not talking about doing anything crazy. Just literally putting weight on your foot. Because what happens is that ligament that runs north to south, it's responsible for holding the two lower leg bones together. Because at the ankle joint, it doesn't have a lot of space. It doesn't have a lot of leeway. So what happens is when that ligament tears or sprains, whenever you step down, the ligament can't hold the bones and it stretches and it pinches the nerve. And it also just really hurts. So the guys who have high ankle sprains, even if it's a grade 1, they don't look the same for probably 6 months. Kamara was quoted saying it took me about 6 months to feel normal again. And he didn't have surgery. This is just regular.
Holy.
Yeah, they're bad. I'm telling you, they're bad. They're very.
Yo, I had Jonathan.
And those are like
Taylor
the simple ones, not the crazy ones. Those are the simple ones.
Yeah, I had Jonathan Taylor last year, and he had the high ankle earlier in the season, tried to come back, re-injured himself. Yep. And you know what? I've always kind of been like, oh, high ankle, you could just wait. You put them on IR. They'll come back after 4 or 6 weeks. It's really one of those injuries where you're like, I probably should look elsewhere. Like, that's
They're
a guy.
awful.
So from now on, I'm going to be like, I got to trade this dude.
Dude, you hear it and you're just like, oh, people are like, oh, I'll buy the dip. You can have him. Best case scenario, he goes back to baseline, but he's got they are frustrating injuries. I mean, you saw a couple of years ago, Adam Thielen had one. He then tried to come back too quickly. I think he came back in like 2 or 3 weeks. He ended up fully what we call fracturing it, and he ended up having to have surgery. A bunch of guys had surgery this past year it's just a frustrating injury. That's what Pollard had. That's what Rashad Penny had, and with fractures, but they both had the same injury basically. They're bad injuries. They're very frustrating, and especially the running backs that are trying to cut and pivot and kind of rotate and get in and out of blocks and get under defenders. You need that ankle to be able to direct you. And you can't do it if it's not cooperating.
Man, it's crazy to think about. So if I wanted to notice stuff, like how would I get this info for you before we get into like players? Because I want to talk about some specific players too, Jesse. How can I call you Doc? Or call you Doc?
Whatever you want. Whatever you want.
I want to call you Doc.
Jesse's fine.
Like this
whatever you want.
So before we get into the players, is there any way that like people can get this kind of information? Is it they have to follow you? Do they need to download something?
Easiest way. So there's 2 places. I'm predominantly only on Twitter. I mean, I had the other ones, but I don't really use them. So I do most of my content on Twitter. And videos are going to be on YouTube and TikTok under the Fantasy Doctors. It's usually DRS, not the full word. And then this is my 3rd or maybe 4th year now. I've done what we call an injury draft guide, which it was exactly what it sounds like. This year, I went even crazier than I have in the past, and I stacked a combination of statistics and analytics as well as injuries. So you're getting all the PFF data, the player profile data, the reception perception. You get all of that analytics. So what does the data show for how good this player is, stripping them of their name? What does the data show? And then add the injury element. This guy's risky. This guy's coming off that injury. This is what the data shows for that. And then I go deep dive into basically each major injury, your Achilles, your ACLs, your Jones, your Liz Franks. And then I give you individual player profiles for the main guys, which we're going to talk about in a sec. And I even do a deep analysis for every rookie, pretty much every relevant rookie. I don't think I did the 7th rounders, but so I last year, a year ago, about this time, I went extra crazy. I took every single quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end that were relevant. I think 450 of them. And I went back to as far as I could go and documented each of their injury histories by hand, personally.
Woo!
So I have injuries from Devontae Adams' Pop Warner days.
Holy smoke. That you got to be like the only person that has that.
There's one other one, but it's not as accurate. Because I know what mine show and I know what theirs shows. So it's not, I mean, sometimes they have stuff that I can't find, but if it's on the internet, there's a good chance it's on there. That one is pretty much free on the fantasydoctors.com. But yeah, I mean, it really shows you like, hey, what happened if I found the surgeon's name? I will write it. I speculate like what I think it was if they didn't comment on it, but just based on what the information showing. And then I write the number of games missed. And you start to see a trend. Like, you want to see a crazy one? Look at Matthew Stafford's. You want to see another crazy one? Look at Julio Jones. There are 60 pages long, 60 profiles long.
Oh my
60
God.
Injuries. That's what we know of. Not the ones we don't know of. Those are just the ones we know of.
Yeah. Yo, make sure you guys if you're watching this, I lost my headphones doing that. If you guys are watching this, make sure you take advantage of that. Go to fantasydoctors.com, download the draft guide, get whatever you can out of that. I'm about to take advantage of that myself. I'm not going to lie to you, man. Let's get in some players, though.